how do we as philosophers wrap our heads around the world, like especially when we can't always, see or touch the things we're trying to understand?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we think about those early weather predictions, right?
Totally.
And then today we have these super intricate climate models. And even when we talk about chaos theory, very abstract stuff, we're relying on indirect methods to understand it.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful and increasingly popular tools in our arsenal is the computer simulation. It's everywhere now.
Oh, absolutely. It's mind-boggling how many fields use them.
Seriously. Like astrophysics, particle physics, material science.
Engineering, fluid mechanics. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Right. Even evolutionary biology, ecology.
Economics, decision theory, medicine, sociology, epidemiology, artificial life, you name it.
So for us as philosophers, this raises a really fundamental question.
Yeah.
How do these computer simulations, these tools, shape our understanding of knowledge itself?
That is the million-dollar question, and that's precisely what we're going to unpack today. So this deep dive is all about the philosophical implications of using computer simulations in science. And we're really going to tailor this for philosophers like you, thinking about how we know what we know. We're going to look at their role in epistemology, how they relate to experiments, how they impact scientific theories, how they help us understand emergence, and even the surprisingly important role of fictions in these models.
Fictions. Okay, that's intriguing. We'll definitely have to
now.
dig into that. But before we go too far, even the term computer simulation feels kind of slippery.
Right.
Like, is there really one clear-cut definition?
No, not really. You can think of it onto different levels, right?
Oh.
You've got the narrow focus, which is just about the computation. And then you've got this broader view, which is the whole scientific process.
Ugh.
And there's even an alternative perspective that looks at like the dynamic similarity between systems, whether there's a computer involved or not.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. Maybe we should start with that narrow perspective first.
Sure.
It's like, what actually is a computer simulation in that computational sense?
Well, at its core, it's a computer program, right?
Oh.
And this program uses algorithms, basically step-by-step instructions, to explore how a mathematical model behaves.
Okay.
And often, this model is trying to represent some real-world system.
Right.
But it could also be like a hypothetical system.
Oh, interesting.
The key thing is the algorithm takes the initial state of the system, defined by certain variables at a specific time, and then calculates how that state changes over time.
So it's like a series of snapshots moving forward in time.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a series of snapshots, and it gives us this numerical picture of how the model behaves. And often we visualize this, sometimes even mimicking the data from real scientific instruments.
It was like creating a virtual lab in a way.
You got it.
Now, I remember reading that simulations are particularly useful when the math is too complex to solve directly.
Absolutely. Paul Humphreys put it really well. He said, simulations are often used to explore the properties of mathematical models where analytic methods are not available.
That makes sense.
But it's not the only reason, right? Sometimes the model itself is already in a form that can be directly simulated.
Okay.
Also, when we deal with continuous equations, the ones describing smooth changes, we have to discretize them.
Discretize.
Yeah, we break them down into finite steps. And because of this, the simulation only gives us an approximation of the true solution, not the exact one.
Oh, I see. So it's not perfectly accurate in that sense.
Right. And it's interesting from a philosophical perspective, even little things like the programming language, the compiler used, or the hardware, they can all subtly affect the results.
Wow. So many factors to consider. So that's the nuts and bolts, the code running on the machine.
Yeah.
But I guess there's a bigger picture here too, right?
Yes, definitely. The broader definition of a computer simulation looks at the entire study, the whole scientific shebang. It's not just the algorithm, but the whole process. Choosing the model, implementing it as a program, running the simulation, looking at the data, and drawing conclusions about the real-world system.
So it's like a complete scientific investigation.
Exactly. And to do it well, you need a lot of expertise. It's not just about raw computing power. You have to understand the model's limitations, where errors might creep in, and how to connect the simulation results back to the actual phenomena.
That's really interesting. It emphasizes the human element in all this.
Absolutely. And, this broader view is usually what philosophers of science focus on when they talk about computer simulations.
Right. Now, you mentioned alternative perspective earlier, one that doesn't necessarily focus on the computer as the defining feature.
Yes. This view defines simulation more generally as any system that acts enough like another system that we can use it to learn about the second one.
Okay, so it's about the analogy between two systems.
Right. Think about the physical model of the San Francisco Bay, the one they built before computers were so widespread.
Oh.
By watching how water flowed in that model, engineers could study what might happen if they made changes to the real bay.
So it's like a scaled-down version of the real thing.
Exactly. And a more recent and maybe surprising example is the creation of dumb holes using Bose-Einstein condensates.
What are dumb holes?
These are fluid systems in the lab that form sonic event horizons, which are like, in a way, similar to black holes.
Wow.
So physicists study these dumb holes to try to learn about real black holes based on the mathematical similarities between how fluids and gravity behave.
That's fascinating. But I think our source material pointed out a pretty key difference between these kinds of physical simulations and computer simulations, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Barbarousse and his colleagues highlight a very important point here for philosophers of science. So in the dumb hole example, right, the fluid in the lab is actually governed by the same kind of mathematical equations as a black hole, or at least they share some fundamental structures. But in a computer simulation of a black hole, the computer itself, as a physical object, isn't actually behaving according to those same equations.
I see. It's running a program that implements those equations.
Exactly. It's not the same thing. And this raises some really interesting epistemological questions, like how do we know what we know when we use simulations, especially when they are not directly mimicking the real world in the same way as a physical model?
That's a really important point. It's like there's this extra layer of abstraction with computer simulations. Okay, so we've talked about this basic definition. Let's move on to the different types of computer simulations because it seems like there's a lot of variety in how they're built and used.
There is. We can broadly classify them into two main categories: equation-based and agent-based simulations. And then there are some really interesting hybrid approaches too.
Okay, let's start with those equation-based ones. What are their defining features?
So equation-based simulations are super common in physics and other fields where we have well-established theories that we can express as mathematical models.
Okay.
Often these models use differential equations to describe how things change over time. And these simulations tend to focus on the overall, global properties of the system they represent. Now, within this category, we can further distinguish between particle-based and field-based simulations.
Oh, interesting. So what's the difference?
In particle-based simulations, you model a bunch of individual things and how they interact.
Okay.
So, imagine simulating how a galaxy forms. You'd track the gravitational interactions between all the stars, each treated as a separate particle.
Yeah.
On the other hand, field-based simulations treat the system as one continuous thing. Think of weather forecasting. You're not modeling individual air molecules, right?
Right.
You're modeling how temperature, pressure, and wind velocity change over space and time, like a continuous field.
So one is all about individual interactions, and the other is about the dynamics of the whole system.
Exactly.
Now, what about those agent-based simulations? How do those work?
Agent-based simulations are really popular in social sciences and behavioral sciences. You also see them in artificial life and ecology.
Okay.
Like particle-based simulations, they involve modeling lots of individual entities, these agents.
Oh.
But the big difference is there aren't any overall equations dictating how all the agents behave. Instead, each agent has its own set of local rules, and these rules can be pretty simple.
I think I remember you mentioning a cool example of this.
Oh yeah, the Schelling model of segregation.
Remind me how that one works.
It simulates a bunch of individuals, let's say 2 different groups, on a grid, like a chessboard. Each individual just wants a certain percentage of their neighbors to be from their own group. If they're not happy with their neighborhood, they move.
Simple enough.
But what's really amazing is that even with this simple preference, the model consistently creates strong patterns of segregation.
Wow, so complex behavior emerges from these simple rules.
Exactly. It's a great example for philosophers because it shows how macro-level patterns can arise from micro-level interactions.
Yeah, that's a mind bender. Now, you also mentioned hybrid models that bridge these different levels of description, the multi-scale simulations.
Yeah, those are really cool. Multi-scale simulations are all about connecting different scales of a system.
Right.
Imagine you're simulating a material that's under stress. Most of the time, you can treat it as one continuous thing.
Right.
But in some specific spots, things are happening at a much smaller scale, maybe at the level of molecules or even atoms.
You need to zoom in.
You got it. And in those areas, you need a more detailed model. And these multi-scale models can work in series, where you run one simulation and then feed the results into another.
Okay.
Or they can run in parallel, where simulations at different scales are running at the same time and interacting with each other. And this is really important when the different scales are closely coupled.
That makes sense. And this leads to subgrid modeling, right?
Yes, especially in fields like climate science and fluid dynamics, where we use grids to represent the system. Subgrid modeling is all about capturing the effects of things happening at a scale smaller than the grid can handle.
Oh, I see.
So in climate models, this is often called parameterization.
Parameterization.
Yeah. It's about representing complex small-scale processes like cloud formation using simplified math. These simplified descriptions use parameters that may or may not have direct physical counterparts. It's basically approximating the average effect on the larger system.
That's really clever.
Yeah.
But as a philosopher, it makes you wonder about how accurate our models can be when we're making these kinds of approximations.
It definitely raises some epistemological questions about the relationship between our models and the real world.
Yeah.
And how much we can trust the conclusions we draw from simulations.
For sure. Now, you mentioned another type of simulation earlier, Monte Carlo simulations.
Oh, yeah. Those are pretty different.
They seem to work on a totally different principle.
They do.
Mm.
Monte Carlo simulations use randomness in their calculations.
Randomness, why?
The key thing is this randomness doesn't necessarily represent actual randomness in the system being modeled. It's more like a computational trick.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow.
Think about estimating the value of pi. You could do it by randomly dropping points onto a square with a circle inside.
Okay, yeah.
By counting how many points land inside the circle, you can get an approximation of pi.
So you're using a random process to get at a deterministic value.
Exactly. And this has led to some debate among philosophers about whether Monte Carlo simulations are real simulations.
Oh, interesting. What's the argument there?
Some argue that they lack a mimetic purpose.
Meaning?
They're not trying to directly imitate the system in the same way that, say, an equation-based simulation does. But others argue that they are simulations because they simulate an imaginary process to help us understand a real one.
I see. It's a subtle but important distinction. So we've got this whole spectrum of simulation types. But why do scientists use them in the first place? What are the main goals?
Our source material lays out three main purposes. First, there's the heuristic function.
Heuristic meaning?
It means they help us communicate and represent knowledge. Think about Watson and Crick's model of DNA. It was a way for them to understand it themselves, and then it became a tool for explaining it to others.
Right.
Similarly, computer simulations can help us visualize and grasp complex processes.
Like what?
All sorts of things, like how bacteria reproduce or how tectonic plates move, things that are hard to observe directly.
So they're like visual aids for complex ideas.
Exactly. And they're incredibly valuable in education and scientific communication.
That makes sense. What's the second purpose?
Prediction.
Predicting the future.
Yep. We use simulations all the time to predict how systems will behave in the future or even in the past.
Okay.
It can be very specific predictions like the path of a hurricane.
Right.
Or more general predictions like whether an ecosystem will remain stable.
Or the potential impacts of climate change.
Exactly. And some predictions are more about ranges of possibilities with probabilities attached.
So there's a lot of variety in how we use simulations to predict things.
For sure. And for philosophers, this predictive power raises a lot of interesting questions about the nature of scientific knowledge and foresight.
Definitely. What's the third purpose?
Understanding.
Okay.
So even when we have data about how a system behaves, simulations can help us explain why it behaves that way. By building a model and running a simulation that matches the data, we can get insights into the underlying mechanisms and causes.
So it's not just about describing what happens, it's about explaining it.
Exactly. And that's a powerful form of scientific understanding.
It really is. Now, all this talk about the different types and purposes of simulations brings us to the heart of the matter. The epistemology of computer simulations, or EOCS for short. As simulations become more and more central to science, sometimes even being the primary source of new knowledge, we have to ask, how do we know if we can trust them? How do we justify our belief in what they tell us?
Yeah, that's the fundamental question. Like, when a simulation gives us new information about the world, what makes us think that information is accurate? It's not direct observation, like in traditional empirical science.
Right.
And it's not pure deduction from axioms, like in logic or math.
So how do we evaluate the reliability of simulations?
The central issue in EOCS is whether a simulation is accurate enough for what it's being used for.
So if we're using it to predict the effect of a new economic policy, the model needs to be accurate enough to base decisions on.
Right. Exactly. And if we're using it to understand a biological pattern, the simulated mechanisms have to be a reliable guide to the real-world processes. And this brings up a really interesting point. Traditional philosophy of science has often focused on justifying theories themselves rather than how they are applied.
Okay.
But EOCS is more about the specific claims we make based on applying theories through simulations.
So it's not just about the general theory, but how it plays out in a specific computational context.
Yeah.
Now, Winsberg argues that EOCS has some unique features that set it apart from traditional epistemology of science.
Yes, he does. He identifies three key aspects. The first is downward inferences.
Downward.
Yeah. In lots of simulation studies, we start with established theories and use them to build our models. The conclusions we draw from the simulations, then, are inferences that move downwards from these general theories to specific cases.
So it's kind of like the opposite of traditional induction, where you go from specific observations to general theories.
Exactly. It's more like deduction, but with all the complexities of computation thrown in.
I see. What's the second feature?
The motley nature of simulation results.
Oddly.
Yeah, like a jester's outfit, lots of different bits and pieces.
Okay.
Unlike in theoretical derivations, the results of a simulation don't depend only on the theory.
They depend on other stuff too, right?
Yes, all sorts of things. How we represent the processes in the model, the numerical methods we use to solve the equations, the approximations we make to simplify things.
And don't forget those fictions you mentioned earlier.
Oh, yeah, those too. And then
Wow.
you've got the hardware and software, even the trial and error involved in getting the simulation to run properly. All these things can affect the outcome.
So the results are kind of a mixed bag, influenced by all these different factors.
Precisely. And for a philosopher, this motley aspect means that we can't just assume the simulation is reliable just because the underlying theory is solid.
Right, there's more to it than that. Okay, what's the third feature Winsberg talks about?
Autonomy.
Autonomy. So the simulation is independent in some way.
In a sense, yes. We often use simulations when we don't have a lot of empirical data or when it's impossible or unethical to get that data.
Like when studying the early universe or predicting long-term climate change.
Exactly. So in those cases, we can't really validate the simulation results by comparing them to observations. The simulation is giving us knowledge about a domain that we can't access directly.
That's pretty profound.
It is. It raises all sorts of questions about how we justify our belief in the knowledge that simulations provide. But, these novel features that Winsberg talks about have also been challenged by other philosophers.
Oh, right. I remember reading about Parker's criticisms.
Yeah. Wendy Parker argues that Winsberg's focus might be a bit too narrow, that he's mostly thinking about equation-based simulations in physics and similar fields. But in other areas like social sciences, where they use a lot of agent-based simulations, the epistemological issues might be different.
Makes sense. Different types of simulations, different challenges.
Right. And Parker also points out that Winsberg doesn't really address the fact that simulations are used for different purposes.
Right. Prediction versus explanation versus just exploring a system.
Exactly. And she thinks the way we evaluate a simulation should depend on what we're using it for.
That makes sense.
And then there's another point of view from Frigg and Rice.
Okay, what do they say?
They argue that the epistemological problems raised by computer simulations aren't actually new. They say it all boils down to two classic issues in philosophy of science.
Which are?
First, is the model a good representation of the target system? And second, are we solving the model's equations correctly?
Okay, so those are pretty fundamental questions in any kind of scientific modeling, not just simulations.
Exactly. Frigg and Rice basically say that computer simulations, while they're cool and powerful tools, don't introduce fundamentally new philosophical problems. But Winsberg disagrees.
Oh, right. He thinks there's something unique about simulations.
Yeah. He argues that it's the combination of all three features, downward inference, motley dependence, and autonomy, that creates a situation that needs special attention.
So it's not just that these issues exist, it's that they all come together in a unique way in simulations.
Exactly. Now let's talk about how EOCS connects to our understanding of scientific experiments.
Yeah, the source material mentions some analogies between the two.
Right. Philosophers have been trying to understand how simulations work by comparing them to experiments.
Makes sense. Experiments are kind of the gold standard in science.
Yeah. For example, people have looked at Franklin's work on how experimental physicists build confidence in their results, and how those ideas might apply to simulations.
So can we think of simulations as a kind of experiment?
Some philosophers think so, at least to some extent. Winsberg draws on Hacking's ideas about experiments having a life of their own. Hacking argued that experimental results can become reliable even if the theories behind them change, and that experimental techniques gain credibility over time.
Okay.
Winsberg suggests that something similar happens with simulations. The techniques and assumptions we use can become self-vindicating, earning their own credentials over time.
So like a tool that proves its worth through repeated use.
Exactly. And this could help us deal with those issues of motley and autonomous knowledge that we talked about. Then there's the idea of severe testing.
Severe testing.
Yeah, this is a concept from Deborah Mayo's work. It's all about putting a hypothesis through a really tough test, a test that it would be very unlikely to pass if the hypothesis were wrong.
Okay.
Parker argues that we should apply this idea to simulations.
So we should ask, does the simulation really put the hypothesis to the test?
Exactly. And she thinks a lot of simulation studies don't do this very well. They just compare the results to data without really arguing for the simulation's power to test the hypothesis.
So it's like a call for more rigor in how we evaluate simulations.
Right. Now, there's a whole practical side to this as well, what practitioners call verification and validation, or V&V.
Okay, what's that all about?
In fields like engineering and computational science, they use V&V to assess how trustworthy a simulation is.
And how do they do that?
It involves two main parts. Verification is about making sure we're solving the model correctly.
Okay.
Like, does the code actually produce the right answers for the equations we're using? Validation is about making sure we're using the right model in the first place.
So verification is about the math, and validation is about the connection to the real world.
Exactly. And there's a huge amount of research on V&V, and philosophers are starting to pay more attention to it.
I think you mentioned there are subcategories within verification.
Right. So there's solution verification, which is about making sure the algorithm we're using actually solves the equations correctly. This often involves comparing the results to benchmark solutions and seeing how the results converge as we make the computational grid finer.
Okay, so it's really about making sure the math is done right.
Yes. And then there's code verification, which is about making sure the code itself correctly implements the intended algorithm.
So even if the algorithm is good, there could be errors in the code itself.
Absolutely. And this is something that philosophers haven't always paid enough attention to.
It seems like such a fundamental thing, though. If the code's wrong, the whole simulation is built on a shaky foundation.
Exactly. Now, when it comes to validation, the most common approach is to compare the simulation results to real-world data.
Makes sense. See if it matches reality.
Right. But this isn't always possible, especially when we're using simulations, because we don't have enough data.
Oh, right. Like in those cases of studying the early universe or predicting long-term climate change.
Exactly. So in those cases, we need other ways to validate the simulation. Maybe comparing parts of the simulation to experiments or to theoretical predictions at different scales. But even the whole idea of validation has been criticized by some philosophers.
Really?
Yeah. For example, Oreskes and her colleagues argue that the word validation can be misleading.
Why is that?
Because it can make people think that we're more certain about the simulation than we really are. Like, we've proven it's true. But especially when dealing with complex systems, that level of certainty might not be warranted.
So it's a cautionary note about overselling the reliability of simulations.
Right. And Winsberg also points out that the idea of verification and validation as totally separate processes can be misleading.
How so?
Well, the model itself might be designed with computational limitations in mind.
Okay.
And the choice of numerical methods might depend on what we know about the model's weaknesses. So the questions of whether we're solving the model correctly and whether the model itself is good are intertwined.
So it's not a clean separation between the math and the real world.
Exactly. And this challenges the idea that we can neatly divide the epistemological issues of simulation into mathematical and empirical parts.
Now let's talk about the concept of epistemic entitlement.
Okay.
This is the idea that we can have justified beliefs even without having all the evidence ourselves, right?
Yes. Like, we're entitled to trust our senses and the testimony of others, even if we can't fully prove they're reliable.
And some philosophers think this idea applies to simulations.
Right. Simulations are complex, they often involve a lot of people working on them, and we might not fully understand how they work.
So the argument is that we're entitled to trust the results, even if we don't have all the details.
Yeah, kind of like we trust a car mechanic, even if we don't know how to fix the engine ourselves.
That's an interesting analogy. But I think there are some objections to this view, right?
There are. Simons and Alvarado argue that Burge's concept of epistemic entitlement relies on the idea of a transparent conveyor.
What does that mean?
Basically, it means that we have some reason to believe the source of the information is reliable and that the information hasn't been messed up along the way. But with simulations, this transparency is often lacking.
Because of all the complexities and potential biases we talked about.
Exactly. They argue that the motley nature of simulation results, the potential for hidden errors in the code, and the difficulties of reproducing results across different systems all make it hard to claim we have this kind of transparent conveyor.
So it's not so simple to just say we're entitled to trust simulations.
Right. Now, some philosophers take a more pragmatic approach to this issue.
Pragmatic meaning.
They focus on the practical skills and experience of the people who build and use simulations.
Okay.
They argue that our trust comes from the craft of modeling, the know-how that's built up over time.
So it's not just about the formal properties of the model, but also the tacit knowledge and skills of the modelers?
Exactly. But again, Simons and Alvarado have an objection.
Oh, they're not convinced.
Nope. They argue that while this practical know-how is important, we still need a good epistemological explanation for why we should trust these simulations.
So it's not enough to just say they work. We need to understand why they work and whether that success is based on solid epistemic grounds.
Precisely. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the relationship between computer simulation and traditional scientific experiments.
You know, it's funny. Scientists often talk about simulation studies as in silico experiments.
Oh, yeah, they do.
But is that just a metaphor, or is there something deeper going on?
That's a great question, and philosophers have been debating it for a while.
So what are the main positions in this debate?
There are two main camps. One is the identity thesis.
Which says?
It says that simulations literally are a type of experiment.
Okay.
The other camp is the epistemological dependence thesis.
Which says?
It says that our justification for believing simulation results depends on how closely they resemble real experiments.
I see. So one says they're experiments, and the other says their justification depends on how experiment-like they are.
Exactly. And both sides have their arguments. Early supporters of the identity thesis pointed out that simulations involve manipulating things and observing the outcomes, just like experiments do.
So you're actively intervening in this system, even if it's a virtual system.
Right. And proponents of the dependence thesis argued that simulations can only give us reliable knowledge if they're grounded in the methods and standards of experimental science.
But I think there are also some strong arguments against the idea that simulations are literally experiments, right?
Yes, there are. One of the most well-known criticisms comes from Gilbert and Troich.
What do they say?
They argue that in a real experiment, you're manipulating the actual object you're interested in.
Okay.
But in a simulation, you're manipulating a model of that object. It's not the same thing.
So, like, if you're studying fruit flies in a lab, you're working with real fruit flies. But in a simulation, you're working with a computational representation of fruit flies.
Exactly. And this distinction between manipulating the real thing versus manipulating a model is important, they argue.
But doesn't that distinction break down when you consider that a lot of experiments also use models or simplified systems?
That's a good point. People have argued against Gilbert and Troich by pointing out that many experiments don't directly manipulate the phenomenon they're ultimately interested in.
Like using model organisms in biology.
Exactly. Or
Yeah.
using simplified physical models to study complex fluid flows.
Yeah.
We do this all the time in science.
So maybe the distinction between manipulating a real object and manipulating a model isn't so clear-cut after all.
It's a tricky issue. Peschard actually defended Gilbert and Troich by making a different distinction.
What's that?
He distinguishes between the epistemic target and the epistemic motivation.
You mean?
The epistemic target is the thing we're directly studying.
Yeah.
Epistemic motivation is the broader reason why we're studying it.
Okay.
He argues that in a simulation, the epistemic target is never the computer itself. It's always something else that the simulation is supposed to represent.
So even if the simulation is running on a computer, we're not actually trying to learn about the computer itself.
Exactly. We're trying to learn about something in the world that the simulation is modeling.
That makes sense. But this whole debate seems to come down to where you place the emphasis.
It does. Do we focus on the difference between manipulating a real object versus a model? Or do we focus on the functional similarities in how we set up the investigation and observe the results? There's no easy answer.
And what about the distinction between formal and material similarity that you mentioned earlier?
Yes. So Gwala and Morgan, while they disagree with Gilbert and Troich, also reject the identity thesis. They build on Herbert Simon's work, distinguishing between formal similarity and material similarity.
That's the difference.
They argue that simulations are based on formal similarity, like the equations in the model might have a similar mathematical structure to the real.